A cardboard box. A basement flooded twice in 30 years. And a photograph that should never have survived either flood, let alone the century before them. When a retired schoolteacher named Miriam Castell opened that box looking for her late husband's tax records, she had no idea she was about to hand historians a mystery with no clean answer. In this video, we walk through exactly what she found, what the experts said when they examined it, and why one detail in the background of that photograph has researchers still arguing today. Stay with us, because the story only gets stranger the closer you look. Miriam wasn't looking for history. She was looking for a manila folder labeled 1998, property taxes, buried somewhere in the sprawl of boxes her husband Walter had left behind in the basement of their Ohio farmhouse. Walter had died 8 months earlier, and Miriam was finally working up the nerve to clean out the space he'd claimed as his own for 40 years, the workbench, the fishing gear, the mismatched filing cabinets full of receipts nobody would ever need again. The tax folder never turned up. What turned up instead was a cigar box, swollen from old water damage, wedged behind a stack of paint cans. Walter had never mentioned it. Inside, wrapped in a page torn from a 1961 newspaper, was a small tintype photograph in a cracked leather case, the kind of case with a tiny brass clasp that had gone green with age. Miriam almost didn't open the clasp. The case looked ready to crumble. But curiosity won, and when she finally worked it loose, she found herself looking at a group of Union soldiers standing in front of a farmhouse porch, rifles at rest, faces caught mid-conversation. It looked, at first glance, like 100 other Civil War-era portraits she'd seen in museums. Old, brittle, unremarkable. Then she noticed the photograph wasn't a tintype at all. Tintypes are metal, cold, slightly reflective, monochrome by nature. This image had the texture of paper, and when she tilted it toward the basement's single bare bulb, she caught the faint but unmistakable rust orange of a soldier's neckerchief. Not staining. Not damage. Color. Miriam's grandson, a graduate student named Theo, was the one who insisted the photograph needed a second opinion. He drove 2 hours to bring it to Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a historian at a regional university who specialized in 19th century material culture and had spent a career authenticating everything from diaries to daguerreotypes. Dr. Marsh had seen her share of miracle finds turn out to be reproductions, so she approached the leather case with polite skepticism. That skepticism didn't survive first contact. Under her loupe, Dr. Marsh could see brush-fine cracking in the emulsion consistent with genuine period photographic paper, the kind of aging pattern that's almost impossible to fake convincingly, since it forms over decades of humidity cycling through fiber layers. But the color was still there, not just the neckerchief, but a faint blue in one soldier's cuff, and a warm brown in the porch's timber that shifted subtly depending on the angle of light, the way natural pigment does and printed dye typically doesn't. Dr. Marsh didn't say much that first day. She photographed the piece from a dozen angles, made careful notes, and asked Miriam if she'd be willing to let the image travel to a conservation lab with equipment better suited to settling the question once and for all. Miriam agreed, on one condition: the photograph itself never left her sight for more than a supervised hour at a time. She already lost a husband that year. She wasn't about to lose the one strange thing he'd left behind without an explanation. At the conservation lab, a materials scientist named Priya Anand ran the photograph through multispectral imaging, a process that captures a surface across wavelengths the human eye can't see, revealing layers of pigment, ink, and paper fiber that are otherwise invisible. What she found didn't fit any of the standard categories for period color processes. The color wasn't applied on top of the image, the way hand-tinted photographs from that era usually were, with watercolor dabbed carefully onto specific features after developing. Instead, the colors seemed to be part of the image's chemistry itself, embedded during processing in a way that closely resembled early experiments with dye-based color photography, techniques that historians generally date to decades after the Civil War, and that weren't commercially viable until the 20th century. Priya was careful with her language. "This isn't proof of time travel," she told Theo, half joking, half serious. "It's proof that somebody, somewhere, was experimenting with color photochemistry earlier and more successfully than the history books give credit for. That happens more than people think." Plenty of inventions get discovered twice, once by someone who couldn't afford to develop it further, and once by someone who got the patent. Paper conservator Daniel Ruiz confirmed the stock itself was period-appropriate, cotton rag fiber consistent with paper milled in the 1860s, with fox marking and edge where that lined up with roughly a century and a half of storage, much of it likely in humid conditions. In his professional opinion, the photograph was not a modern forgery. Whatever process had produced the color, it had been done at or very near the time the picture was taken. While the science team debated chemistry, Theo kept returning to the image itself, specifically, to a man standing just at the edge of the porch, half in shadow, wearing a coat with no visible unit markings. Everyone else in the photograph wore insignia consistent with a documented Ohio infantry regiment that Theo was able to identify from the belt buckles and cap style. This one man had neither. Theo spent a weekend combing through digitized regimental rosters, pension records, and local county histories, trying to place him. He came up empty, until he thought to search his own family's genealogy records instead of official military ones. Buried in a county historical society's newsletter from 1954 was a short item about a local farmer named Elias Castell, Miriam's husband's great-great-uncle, described as having served unofficially as a courier and scout attached to various Union units operating in the region, though he held no formal commission. No formal commission. No official record. Just a name that happened to match a family Miriam had married into, and a story that happened to end up in her basement. Dr. Marsh cautioned against reading too much into a coincidence. Local militias, scouts, and informal couriers were common throughout the war, and plenty of men served in ambiguous, undocumented roles, guides who knew the terrain, farmers who carried messages between camps, civilians pressed into temporary service and never formally enlisted. It wasn't unusual for such men to vanish from official rosters entirely, precisely because they were never on them in the first place. The mystery wasn't necessarily sinister. It might simply be a gap in the historical record, the kind genealogists run into constantly. Still, Theo couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph had been kept, hidden, really, for a reason. Photographs from that era were expensive and rare. Families held onto them for people who mattered. If Elias Castell was just a passing acquaintance, why did his portrait survive in a locked case for 160 years, tucked behind paint cans in a basement no one else was meant to search? The answer, when it came, arrived almost by accident. While cataloging the leather case for the lab's records, Daniel Ruiz noticed the lining had come slightly loose at one seam. Carefully, with Miriam's permission, he opened it further and found a folded scrap of paper tucked flat against the case's spine, clearly placed there deliberately, and clearly meant to stay hidden. The paper was brittle but legible. It was a short note, and signed except for the initial E, addressed to someone named Sarah. It read, in part, that the writer had seen more of this war from the shadows than most see from the line, and that he hoped the photograph would someday let his family know I stood where I was needed, even if my name never sits beside the others. Dr. Marsh was quick to note that this kind of quiet, humble language was common in personal letters of the period. Soldiers and irregulars alike often downplayed their own roles, either out of modesty or because their work genuinely was meant to go unrecorded. It wasn't proof of some grand secret mission. It was, more likely, the plain testimony of a man who spent the war doing unglamorous, dangerous work that never earned him a place in the official story, carrying messages through contested roads, guiding patrols around ambushes, doing the unremarkable labor that keeps armies functioning but rarely makes it into textbooks. For Miriam, that was enough. She didn't need Elias Castell to have been a spy or a bodyguard or anything larger than life. She needed to know why her husband had kept a locked box in the basement for 40 years without ever mentioning it, and now she had an answer that made sense. Some families just keep the evidence of an ancestor's quiet service, generation after generation, because letting it disappear felt like a small betrayal. The final report from the conservation lab took nearly 4 months to complete. Its conclusion was carefully worded, the way scientific conclusions tend to be when the evidence points somewhere unexpected. The photograph appeared to be an authentic period object, produced using an early and evidently non-standard color process whose exact formula the team could not fully reconstruct. but whose chemical signatures were consistent with organic dyes and light-sensitive compounds that would have been available, if not common, in the 1860s. In plainer terms, someone in that era, likely a photographer experimenting outside the commercial mainstream, had found a way to introduce limited color into a photographic print years before the process became standard practice. It wasn't magic, and it likely wasn't unique. Historians of photography note that plenty of amateur experimentation from that period went undocumented, its results scattered into private collections and family boxes rather than professional archives. What made this particular photograph remarkable wasn't that it broke the laws of physics. It was that it survived at all, protected, hidden, and passed down by a family that seemed to understand, on some instinctive level, that it mattered, even if they couldn't say exactly why. Rather than sell the photograph to a collector, Miriam donated it to the County Historical Society on the condition that Elias Castell's letter be displayed alongside it. She wanted people to read his words, not just look at his face. The exhibit, when it opened, was modest, a single case in the corner of a small county museum, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. That felt right to her. Elias himself, by all accounts, had spent his life being easy to miss. Dr. Marsh continues to study the photograph's chemistry, hoping to eventually identify the specific process used, in case other examples exist scattered in other family collections, unrecognized. Theo, for his part, has started digitizing his family's remaining papers, wondering what else might be waiting in the seams of old boxes. And Miriam, when asked what she thought the whole experience meant, gave an answer simpler than anyone expected. She said she didn't think Elias Castell was trying to send a message across a century and a half. She thought he was just a man who did his job quietly and hoped that somewhere down the line, someone would notice. Somewhere down the line, someone did. What would you do if you opened an old box and found proof that a quiet member of your own family had a story no one ever told? Would you go looking for the rest of it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the objects history almost forgot.